Hello, everyone. So before we begin our welcome, I want to draw everyone's attention to the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click on the globe icon, you're able to select the English or French channel. On the French channel, our interpreter, Darcy, will be translating the presentation from English to French. Today's slides will be in both languages. So welcome to the second webinar of the Integrating the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Calls to Action into Nursing Education Workshop Series. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're gathering virtually today from many of the traditional and unceded territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in all parts of Canada. Here in Montreal, I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. The Canadian Institute of Health Research and Indigenous Health Research Chairs in Nursing have co-designed and are co-delivering this 5-part series to support anti-racist and decolonial practices in nursing education as a collective response to the Implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. Kazan is pleased to be able to present these workshops to support schools in implementing actions to address Call to Action 24, which is now included in Kazan's accreditation standards. I'd like to go through some housekeeping items before the presentation begins. Due to the large number of participants, you'll be on mute for the duration of the session. You're welcome to use the chat to interact with each other during the presentation. You'll be invited to interact with the presenters and your fellow attendees through discussion questions using Mentimeter. We will be providing a link and QR code to be able to access polls and engagement questions during the presentation. The presentation will conclude with an opportunity for questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. Please do not put questions in the chat. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the presentation. You'll be able to see the questions posed by the entire audience in the Q&A box. We encourage you to upvote questions you would like the speakers to respond to by pressing the thumbs up button under the question, rather than posing duplicate questions. Finally, as I mentioned at the start, I want to repeat that you're able to listen to the presentation in French or English by clicking on the interpretation button and picking the language channel of your preference. Today's presentation will be recorded and shared in the coming days. The second workshop of the series is on the topic of cultural humility. The workshop will be presented by Dr. Wanda Phillips-Beck and Dr. Jason Hickey. Thank you very much. Wanda and Jason, over to you to begin your presentation.
Thanks, Lois. Welcome, everybody. We'll be doing our some introductions a little bit later, but for now, I just wanted to acknowledge the sponsors and supporters and students and our colleagues and everyone else who's contributed towards this. Kazan has been a great partner to work on this workshop series with, and the development of the workshops was supported by funding from Indigenous Services Canada. We can go on to the next slide now. So Lois, thank you for starting off with a land acknowledgement. So I won't repeat that, but I'm joining from the unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Wolastoqey people. And I'm going to pass it over, before we get fully started, I'm going to pass it over to Miigam'agan to get us started off in a good way.
Walalin Jason, Walawi Ahotukiscook. So I want to thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for the invitation, and it's an honor to be sitting here to provide or support our circle today in acknowledging gratitude and thanksgiving for the much needed work and the great circle that is here with us today. So I will offer thanksgiving in my mother tongue on behalf of the work that is happening here. I have medicine here, Utimaway, tobacco, and tobacco is it's one of the main medicines that our people across the land draw on to provide guidance and medicines and directions. And Demawe is its property is uniting uniting us and uniting the energies and the unseen world, both physical and non-physical, and the work that's happening behind or all around us in this area of importance. So, Akchigisuk, Chijahamijina, Chiniskamijina, Miwarem Dandeligan Muyak, Giskuk Nimajuahan, Miwarem Dandel Mawaliak, Miwarem Mektiganodi, Edawachtima Giskuk, Miguerem and Dawaju Sit Hamuriku, Achtebikanaten, Maulugudnen, Abajuna Hardnen, and Tluguahan Minau, Ahabaji Abahon Madumene, Mahamigo, Gijinu Sit Hamu, Mimajuinu, Nego, Imudnen, Uchidabohon Moanen, Abohon Masultinen, Nujin Pisukti, Bachtan Delim Piloki, Mimajuinu, Sukoyo Yabajag, and Dande Sit Pieces, Nimej, someone. Nibooked after stairs it sisip a kidno depkuna set a bidu no gumijino nagu set a hankijino ma sithamu a kuchino musagisk regularly chitandaligan mo yakisko oh I'm sukoidly after Juna Hardnen so Dandalik Lamsa da Soktivini Kungi Gimina. But I'll send it back to you, Jason. Thank you for.
Well, then, Miigam'agan, I was looking forward to that all day, to be honest. I've been a bit nervous about the workshop, today's workshop, but I knew that was going to help me relax a little bit. Thank you.
Yes.
All right, I think, Wanda, I'll pass the virtual talking stick to you now.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much, Miigam'agan, for that beautiful prayer. My spirit understood, although it was spoken in a dialect that I don't understand. So I just want to talk very briefly about what we plan on doing today. And just after that, we will have an opportunity to introduce ourselves in a little bit more detail and locate ourselves within this work. But for today, we're going to basically go through the presentation by starting with our knowledge keepers and having them share from their perspectives what cultural humility means from a traditional perspective. We're going to circle back to some of the more academic discourse around cultural humility, and then we will come and share some case examples. Some of these examples are personal cases that we experienced ourselves. And then we will have a discussion on some of the learnings and teachings from these multiple perspectives. And then we'll hand it back to the knowledge keepers to close us off in a good way. And that is just respectful of the way that we do work with Indigenous people and knowledge keepers, that we often will provide them with the first opportunities to speak and circle back to them in the end. And the next slide. So objectives for today is really to learn about those perspectives in regard to cultural humility from both a Mi'kmaq and a Cree perspective, then review those concepts from more of an academic lens, and then have that discussion and some questions via Mentimeter, which is as interactive as we can get with this format and many people. And then we will come back to consider how these concepts can be applied to nursing education and practice. So let's start with the more formal introductions. And again, I will hand it over to Elder and Grandmother Mabel Horton to start us off.
Hello, Tansy. I'm currently in British Columbia, although I am from Manitoba, and I wish to welcome everyone that's online. And I don't know if you can see me because all I see is a screen and Wanda's face, which is nice. Anyway, for introduction, because I assume we'll be talking more anyway on what our topic of the webinar is. So I am retired from nursing, 11 years in January. I worked with Wanda before, with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and then with the First Nations Social Secretariat of Manitoba, which is an arm of health arm of AMC. And before that, I was in Northern nursing for many years, 45 years actually. I nursed for in my career, starting in a Mennonite community, and then in the North Manitoba and in the Arctic, and then back to public health, and then politics organizations on research and advocacy. And then I am married 54 years and to the same man, and 2 children. Well, children, they're adults now. This is where I am with my son. He's in his 40s with 2 grandsons. And our daughter is in Manitoba, heading out south as the snow flies, as they say. In Manitoba, it's snowing. And looking forward to the day. So I'm sure we'll have lots to share. And I'll talk some more later. Yosani.
So Miigam'agan, I know you opened us up in a good way with your beautiful prayer, but would you mind just telling us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes. So again, thank you, and thank you, Mabel. It's wonderful to be to know that you're holding space for us where the sun sets, and I'm holding space here where the sun rises. So I think it's a real honor to be able to know that and envision that in how we are in both coming from matricultural societies. So that feels really right today, especially in the area of what we're here for today. So I'll introduce myself with a Bexi Askenua Bridge, Wogama Najagech. Dan that I look wahanam na de buku ay angko de mai anu mahamigeo mi majuahan minu dan dali angko dasik mahamigeo abaktugo elko bi gespege traditional governing council hi so I'll just share also in my in the English. So I am from Wabanaki, and Miigam'agan, our people are now known as Miigam'agan. We knew ourselves always as Innu, the people. Then which Wabania, the people of first light. Wabanaki is our collective understanding of ourselves, people from the dawn lands, and that I am one of the members of our own traditional governing council on Gaspegiai, District 7 in Miigam'agan Government Council. So we're a traditional body in our homelands. And so I, outside of that, I hold a position, responsibility at the St. Thomas University as the elder in residence. And my responsibility over there is to provide cultural and spiritual support to First Nation students, as well as other students who are looking for research or references. So I'm kind of like a doorkeeper there to bring in knowledge keepers on campus. so that our students will have that resource as well. I am my grandmother was a midwife, and so I grew up in that lineage of wives in my family, and so after she had passed, I was also the first one in my community to have a home birth at a young age, and when it was illegal in New Brunswick, but it was also honoring and practicing our own traditional practice. I wanted to bring my child into the world in a ceremonial space, a way of our ancestors. So I had several women in the time when she was arriving. My community was very aware that I was given birth that early that morning because it was illegal in New Brunswick. And so this is a place that is very important to me. And so I honor the work that's happening now with birthing and midwives, women being trained to be midwives. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And I don't want to take too much more time of what we're here for. So I will leave with that. And thank you again for giving me this space. I'll pass it back to you, Wanda.
So thank you. And I guess at this point, I will just tell you a little bit more about myself. And I will greet you in my language, and that is to tell you who I am in my language, and that is Gijiba, Wabishke, Wabigun, Wenepikau, and Dunjiba, and Makwa and Dundam. So my English name is Wanda Phillips-Beck, but the name that I was given as a youngster translates to White Morning Lily in the English language. I am a nurse by background. I've been a nurse for many years as well, 33 plus years. I started off my career working in Northern Manitoba and then moved on to work in health policy and now entirely in research. I continue to work as a casual nurse in the North and provide nursing services just to keep my skills relevant and keep my pulse on what is happening in the community. So I'm bringing you greetings from Treaty 5 territory here in Manitoba. I am presently sitting on in my traditional territories in Treaty 5, attending a workshop beyond this webinar that we are having here today. And I say thank you very much for joining us today, and I will hand it over to Jason.
Miigwech, Wanda. I'll try to use the language of this territory to introduce myself as well. So Nildali was Jason Hickey, New Jao, Newfoundland, Nuet Ekpahak. So I'm not Indigenous. I grew up in Newfoundland, but I live in Fredericton now, which the traditional name for this area is Ekpahak, which means where the tide ends. So we're the farthest place up the Willistuck River where you can observe the tidal action. I'm an associate professor of nursing at the University of New Brunswick. I work fairly closely with Wanda and also with Miigam'agan on a number of different projects. Mental health nursing is my background, I guess, but I've done a lot of my research training overseas, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. And yeah, cross-cultural community focus. What's up, Gina? Newfoundland as well, that's great. It's always nice to find Newfoundlanders in various places. Yeah, I've got a wife, beautiful, wonderful wife who I met when I was 19 years old, and still very happy to spend every day with her 24 years later. 2 beautiful daughters who would like me to include my dog as a family member as well, but I'm still on the fence about that one. And before I pass it over to Beckaloo, actually, I wanted to just mention, I meant to mention at the beginning that the workshop is about cultural humility, but we also tried hard to kind of incorporate our perspectives on humility into the way that the workshop was developed and the way that it's delivered. So we're trying to demonstrate as much as possible that humility in our own practice. And one example is here on this page. So when we did the workshop the first time, that would have said Elder Mabel Horton and Elder Miigam'agan. But Wanda raised the question in our planning session for this and asked, what Miigam'agan and Mabel, if they were comfortable with that term or if not. And we had an interesting discussion about that and landed on the term Kookum because it's very similar in both Mi'kmaq and in Cree. And Kookumij is the word that Mi'kmaq would use, and it kind of translates to grandmother or clan mother. And so that's the word that we landed on. And I also wanted to acknowledge that Mi'kmaq is missing a K in that, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I think that's it, and I'll pass it on to Becca Lou. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Becca Gash. I am in Winnipeg, which is training number 1. I am a master's student in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba.
So thank you very much, everybody, for introducing themselves. What I did not say at the very beginning, I'm Anishinaabe Kwe, and I guess maybe you assumed that by my affiliation to the Hollow-Water First Nation. So Jason, do you want to explain what we're doing here?
Sure. So I'm assuming that most of you were in the workshop with Emily and Lisa, and I believe they also, the first workshop, and I believe they also use this, but if not, it's fairly straightforward. Use your phone or computer or tablet to go to that website and enter that code, or you can use the QR code if you're familiar with that. And I think you still have to enter that same 8-digit code. And so once you go on there, we're going to ask you some questions and we'll see real-time data on what your answers are, which is helpful because yeah, it's not ideal, I guess, to be in a virtual environment for something like this, but we decided that Mentimeter at least helps us get to know who we're with a little bit better than we would be able to otherwise. All right, I think we can move ahead, Becca Lou. So question number 1, what province or Canadian territory are you joining us from? And I noticed as well that some people were starting to put in the chat the traditional territory that they're in. So if you'd also like to post in there the non-Canadian or colonial territory, please feel free to do so. Great, so we've got a little spread, missed the code. Does anybody have the code there for anybody who missed it?
It's on the top slide. Yeah.
Okay.
39762591.
Great. Okay. So mostly from Ontario and Quebec. One brave soul from Newfoundland, including in addition to me. All right. Yeah, we can go on to the next one now. All right. So do you identify as First Nation, Métis, or Inuit?
I just want to remind everyone the code is on the top of the slide. So it's 39762591.
Yeah, and if you don't have the QR code, you can just go to the website there, menti.com. It's hard to develop a workshop like this because the participants are quite diverse, and we want it to be as careful or reflective as possible, I guess, and not assuming that people didn't know anything, that we were only talking to non-Indigenous people or that we were only talking to Indigenous people. So we've tried to take a general approach to most of this. And so we hope that's how it plays out. You go ahead to the next one now, Becca Lou. Are you in the nursing field? Very good. All right. So if you're in the nursing field, which of the following best describes your work? So yeah, okay. I'm hoping you can read those. Service delivery, educator, administration, researcher, student. So similar to the last workshop, mostly educators joining, but with a mix of roles for sure. And some people probably have multiple roles as well.
So the next set,
Yes, go ahead, Robin.
yeah, the next set of slides are about cultural humility, just to see where you're at in terms of your knowledge. And it's rated on a scale of 1 to 5. So I can see everybody is around the middle, somewhere in the middle in terms of your knowledge, understanding.
We spoke about this a bit last time, Wanda, but you know, I think both of us, Wanda and I at least, feel a little uncomfortable being here delivering, you know, this workshop as the presumed experts. I don't think either of us necessarily feel like that. You know, everybody on here, I think, has plenty to learn. So hopefully we all come away from this with a little bit more knowledge at least.
Yeah, this slide is basically just asking you to provide in 1 or 2 words what that means to you. And then we'll see if that differs at the end when we circle back to the Mentimeter in the end. That's awesome. I see that respect and understanding and safety are faring the highest in these responses. So that's really good. Okay, so we'll just, again, at this point, hand it back over to our knowledge keepers or Kookums. We will give Mabel an opportunity to share from her experience what cultural humility means from a Cree perspective, and as well as hand it over to Mi'kma'an to talk about it from a Mi'kmaq perspective. So Mabel,
Yes.
are we able to? Okay.
Yeah. Igosani, I just want to reiterate my name in case, well, it's on the screen anyway, but Mabel Horton, Ntikawin Mitito Kunu Skunsligason, Nistawayasi Gozi, Bisintoti. That's our standard greeting in our culture in Manitoba. And again, appreciate listening to the presenters, and then with your feedback for the educators being wonderful. And just to give you another quick background, just so we have the context in mind for our topic for nursing. I'm Rocky Cree from Northern Manitoba. And for those that don't know, there's Woodlands Crees and there's Prairie Crees. And we're, I think, the largest nation in Canada. And then at least for the Cree-speaking nations, more or less from the Yukon area all the way to James Bay, and most of Northern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and of course in the Prairie region. So, and then towards the Cree as well in Quebec. And then I mentioned that I'm nurse background and worked in a hospital in southern Manitoba, which was a Mennonite community. And so talk about cultural shock on both sides, I guess, for us. And for me, I was there just for a short while. And then I went directly to Norway House Hospital, which is our Cree country there. And then I did outpost nursing in Cross Lake and God's Narrows, and in the territories in Eskimo Point, it was called then, Arviat. And then to public health, and then the political organizations that I mentioned. So the area that I covered was e-health, the telehealth type of stuff, and the electronic health records, and a bit of diabetes research, of course, and doing policy analysis, health policy with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And with that work, there weren't many nurses at the time working in those organizations, the political ones. So we were doing stuff like midwifery and things that there was no actual dedicated person for those jobs. So we were pulled in to help as we go along. Other duties as assigned, I guess they call them. But anyway, back to my understanding of the word in Cree, and I'm sure like for Indigenous points of view, we're all related in Canada and the States, and even in with our neighbors and fellow researchers in New Zealand and Australia that we have had contact with. We all have, I think, an Indigenous worldview of things. And of course, with nursing, it's very important to have that. I think part of the reason we go into nursing is exactly the way we view mankind and ourselves to begin with, is to try and help others. So I think we're not preaching to the people that don't know about humility, because we go through so much as nurses, whether you're male or female or otherwise. Just to in our language, the Cree language, there's no gender, so which is wonderful. I think in this day and age, especially important that the way we address ourselves as peoples. And I guess with that is the humility factor. And in Cree, it's itapahatimuin. So it's you're looking at yourself humbly and not better than anybody else. And you do the best you can to help your people, your family, and the nations, and not be. I think there's other traditions that do that. You know, the old peg your head on the head, whatever it means, but not to be above other people. And with the mental meter there, with respect being the most important one, because you have to respect other human beings, as we know, and not make fun of them. In our teachings at home, there weren't that many disabilities at the time when I was growing up. I'm 74, and I left home when I was 10 for residential school. But we were taught by our grandparents that you have to really respect the elderly, especially the elders and the little ones. And also with our work, when we go into the communities, you have to accept that you're in somebody else's territory, and you are also a guest there. So again, in our teachings, when you go into somebody's house, you respect what they do, and the person you're visiting, usually, well, in my time anyway, they offer you tea for sure, and bannock and something to eat, or their favorite food, which used to be the wild game and the wild fish and berries. So all that you have to reciprocate. And so you're showing humility in that respect. And like I said, you're not better than the other person. And of course, in us nurses, you have to establish trust with all your clients, whether you're in the hospital, public health, or research, and to establish that trust and to ask permission to be in that community. And of course, to do research with the blessings from that community or those people you're working with. And of course, love is important as well as the center of things for all of us, for yourself and for your clients and the world at large. I also saw understanding on the when people were thinking what humility meant, and that is actually really important, especially now in this day and age with the TRC and the residential school movement or Insured Day, and to understand where we are coming from. Plus, when immigrants come to our country, I've been invited also to share our knowledge with them, how to view us, and not to think you know something right away. Plus, also when you meet people, when you're first immigrant, I don't know, I've heard these anecdotes, I think I mentioned in the last webinar, that it didn't take long for the immigrants to have their own biases as they came to our country on how they look at First Nations on the street or people with addictions, and just being judgmental, because that's what they heard with the colonization, with the drunken Indian on Main Street type of thing. So it didn't take them long to get into that mode as well, which is very unfortunate. But we also have And all this always includes humility. You always have to go back to that thing. It seems to recapture everything. And it's also with empathy and sympathy. And I think it's very holistic for us. Like, we don't put things in compartments like medicine does. And so it includes the circle of life from before babies and during childhood, and then towards the end of life as well. So there's lots to think about, and I'm sure the people that are joining us have lots of examples that they can associate with as well. And like I said, those are the things that came to mind offhand. It's always better if I spoke in my language, but I don't think there's many Cree speakers out there with you. And it just makes more sense when we talk in our language, and it just English is our second language. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I might interject as we go along, if that's okay. And then maybe as I go through the seminar, when we have our closing remarks, I'll also add that perspective. So Igosani, and I wish you a good session. There was it. Thanks, Wanda.
Thank you, Grandmother Mabel, for sharing those perspectives. And I'm hearing so much that is just packed in your message around how our languages are often gender neutral, and what implications that has for acceptance, and how we view the human spirit as being equal rather than binary as male and female. So I think that is very important to consider. Also, concepts such as respect and reciprocity are very important when it comes to our interactions in the healthcare system, and how we action those values when we interact within the academy with each other, as well as with our students. So I think those are important concepts to keep in mind. The importance of acknowledging when you're visiting a territory, I think we are getting better at it. I'm hearing more and more as I go across this country about land acknowledgements, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind that those acknowledgements need to come from the heart. They need to be personally meaningful to you, and how you are going to commit yourself to reconciliation. So just to keep that in mind, and we can circle back to all of these, but I'm just sort of drawing on some of the major points that you had made. And in regard to our language, and how not only is our language beautiful in that it does not delineate between male and female and create that dichotomy, and how we treat people differently, but it's also in how and how our spirits identify themselves in that respect, and whether it is being gender neutral, or even in implications in terms of how we communicate as healthcare providers. And if we are thinking and conceptualizing different concepts in our language, how difficult sometimes that is to translate that into English, or vice versa. So and when we are interacting with patients in the healthcare system, or students in our context, then think about how challenging that is for speakers who learn their language first and then come into our institutions, about those concepts, and how we sometimes are impatient. And if our First Nation or Indigenous students may be struggling with writing skills, for instance, or even the English concepts, how sometimes they're difficult to grasp. So a lot of messages packed in that, and thank you so much, Grandmother Mabel, for showing it. So now let's hand it over to Mi'kmaq, and let's hear from the Mi'kmaq perspective.
Thank you, Wanda. Thank you, Mabel. I want to weave into, even though like we're talking about Cree and Mi'kmaq perspective, when we come back again into our perspective that we're relatives, and so we're all the Mi'kmaq and Cree share a root a language, and we have similar root words, similar worldview, and we're part of a larger network of nations we know as Alagunk, Algonquin ancestry, or that connection. So I want to acknowledge that, and that our homelands are very much tied together from the East Coast to the West Coast, and the ocean culture and land culture is so paramount for our where our language source and where our worldview originates, and we still carry and hold that. We can go a bit more deeper when we look at all of humanity, and that when we begin to look at our ancient cultures, our ancient systems, in deep rootedness of all these heritages globally, and dig deep in our root network of we'll all find each other, because the source comes from our Usithamu, our Mother Earth, no matter where we're at in the world. And I feel like the natural law and the common good and human needs all come back up to the surface, and that the highlight of or the primary practice in all humanity of those ancient systems, and more so like right at this time, we're all trying to reconnect with those practices when our families were healthy, and when our nations were like thriving, and all of humanity globally was truly living in peace. Those are those areas that we need to, those seeds that were seeded by our ancestors, we need to bring them back out from the undergrowth and apply them in our daily work and in our home spaces. And so home is, or dwellings are all sacred, and so wherever we're at, we become the best host. We give the best to our visitors, and we give them the best care, the most comfortable space in the house, and and so I feel like that practice, that love and care should merge into in the workspaces and the institutions of hospitals, care systems, and all of that. That when people come in to be regarded as guests, and that we host them and give them the best care, those feelings of welcomeness and those loving hands that are out, come on in, and all of that is the first dose of wellness that provides that optimal health, is when we're cared for and treated with respect and regard. And then we don't need to know each other in our culture by our first names, but we know who we are, because we operate as well, or that we the language has been our foundation and our worldview that guided us through any given situations, and we know the results when humanity and people are not treated equally and with respect, that we see the conditions, in particularly our people and any person actually, if they're rejected and they're not regarded in the society. And it's not like any human being designed that. It's we designed those circumstances by working too tightly in different protocols that maybe are not inclusive to others, and it takes courage to be heart open, heart led, but that exists in all of us, and as caregivers and human champions, I think that's really what's needed. And we're really fortunate for some of, and it doesn't have to be Indigenous, but in the Indigenous language, it's this is the foundation and the worldview that still is coming through us, despite all the challenges that doesn't support that. And I'm so thankful in hearing all, the movement and the champions out there in the institutions and people who are activists who really push this forward to make those changes and creating 94 calls to action, the truth and reconciliation, and so on. And so it's hopeful because I know in that way, it wasn't just pushed by Indigenous people. There were allies and people who were still heart-led and heart-focused that come together to create these spaces. And I'm really excited and hopeful when I see the numbers of people that have joined on to this webinar and to want to learn and want to make change and create those spaces that are supposedly congruent to the philosophy of the training that's taken about in your professions. And so cultural humility is a human experience of what we want. We talk about Cree and Miigam'agan perspective on humility. I struggled with that English word because I couldn't wrap my mind around it, because our language is prior to colonization, and I study with a group of people about the rematriation of the language, and that's been such a wonderful insight how our languages are our mother tongue and mother-centered. And so it's bringing in care that our language is holistic and so heart-centered. So it's natural, like that all of those protocols or those ways of being is held in the languages. And all the ancient languages, I want to add. So absolutely, and that's humility and humanity. Someone just shared, it's one in the same. And I think these are, I'm so grateful. I was a little bit off when Jason had invited me to these conversations and talking about humility, and had lots of conversations, because I was trying to grasp, what does the English mean, in English, humility mean? Because I have to incorporate that into what our language is bringing, how we look at that. And I couldn't find a word because it's incorporated and it's in our language. And so, we've become overwhelmed, and whenever I go and share our cultural teachings and in any given profession, organizations, and I bring out the teachings of what we have researched as well in the East Coast, and the feedback I get, because it's such a beautiful practice, that I can see why our languages were outlawed, because that way of thinking and that way of being is held in our languages. And so in the reclamation of our original worldview or origin of who we are, is our identity comes from the language. So now it's to look at decolonize the language, because that's exactly what's happened. Our languages were outlawed, and then they were taken and sterilized, and the spirit of the language was removed, the feminine perspective of the language was removed. So some of us who are still fluent in the language we were speaking through the colonial lens. And so now in the reclamation of the language, all of that is flowering back into our conversations, what the languages actually say. And so it's a very powerful awakening in the East Coast, and realigning to our ancient knowledge and an ancient way of being. And when I share this wonderful history of many people give me feedback and ask, Miigam'agan, with these beautiful teachings and this history, why is your community suffering? Why is there such a breakdown? And I keep saying, and I'll keep saying, it's not because of our culture. It's the absence of it. And so this is what I want to weave into and sharing my perspective on humility, and how those ancient languages, all of us, we all come from a heritage, and we all come from that ancestral heritages that we need to dig deep and bring out, because it's their health. Our story, Indigenous stories, perspectives are not much different when we begin to look deep into our human connections. So thank you. I'll just leave it at that and pass it back over to Wanda or Jason. Eulalia, thank you.
Thank you so much, Grandmother Kookum Miigam'agan, for that teaching. There's so many powerful messages again, but I think what really stands out for me is the points about our language again, and how humility is really about the human experience and how we want to be treated. And all of these concepts are embedded within our language, and how important that is to reclaim that space. I also have really been touched by your knowledge around us being relatives, and that really has huge implications for us within the academy in regard to how we created these hierarchies of, within institutions and between institutions. Like for instance, in the academy, we have deans, we have associate deans, we have assistant professors, we have professors, and all the way down to the lowly student, and those power differentials and how they play out in how we interact with each other. So lots to think about. So miigwech to both of you. And I think that what we're going to do now is just to talk. We've heard about the perspectives from both the Cree and the Mi'kmaq perspectives, and what that means in terms of humility. And really, because it was a concept that did not exist in these languages, it really is a conversation about centering, and that is centering ourselves as who we are, and who we are as Anishinaabe. And there are other perspectives that we're going to go into as well. But from what we have learned in the past 20 years or so around cultural humility, it is a process. It is a process of self-reflection to understand personal and systemic biases and to develop and maintain respectful processes and relationships based on mutual trust. So that is packed into a very academic statement, but as we heard from our grandmothers, humility really involves the human experiences and acknowledging that this is a process that is lifelong, and we are all learners when it comes to understanding each other and our human experience. So next slide. So then we get into some discourse, of course, as we always do in the academic literature, but I want to draw as well on the work that's being done and acknowledge the good work that's being done by the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia. So I borrowed this diagram from their website and from their reports because they are really leading the way in this work. And they look at cultural humility as a process and a learning journey for each and every one of us that begins with each individual. And you'll see that many of those concepts that we had unpacked from both grandmother Mabel Horton and Mi'kma'gan is that these concepts are embedded within this diagram as well. And deeply embedded in our languages and our traditional teachings around cultural humility. Next slide. We also have the academic perspectives and a lot of conversation happening in the literature around cultural safety and the whole continuum from that conversation that began around cultural awareness, cultural safety, cultural humility, on the way to anti-racism and on the way to cultural competence. So that these conversations have been happening and occurring for the past 20 years. And this here is just a picture of a gathering that we had in Winnipeg of the Indigenous Research Chairs and our students, where we had some conversations about these concepts, but also planning for the future and how we were going to address the calls to action, particularly call to action 24 within the academy and in particular nursing schools. Next slide. So as we have read and shifted our perspectives on cultural awareness from being aware of one's culture and others' culture, to cultural humility, we know and acknowledge that there are many definitions, but it's still not clearly defined. Although we do see that there's quite agreement around cultural humility as being a process and being aware of your own biases that may perhaps are derived from your cultural beliefs and worldviews, and then applying and using this awareness to apply culturally sensitive approaches when we are interacting with Indigenous people or other people that may be in different circumstances than our own. So there are also
Wanda, sorry to interrupt. I think we might have skipped the slide where we share our own personal perspectives, you and I, or will we do that after the academic perspectives?
Yeah, you're right. Where did it go?
Vanished.
Oh,
maybe
okay.
Maybe right here.
Well, okay. So before we jump into the academic discourse, we were going to share some examples of some personal experiences that we've had in where we encountered cultural humility or not. And I'm going to share my story, and I'll do it very, very briefly now. I know I jumped ahead. So about 24 years ago or so, I myself was quite involved in the healthcare system. I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. At that time, I was nursing an 11-month-old infant, and I had a 4-year-old at home. And as would anybody who is facing a very serious illness in their lives, I reflected on my life and my options for treatment and care. and drew on some of the teachings and learnings and some of the practices that were from many years ago had gone underground and were quite hidden. So I explored my options for treatment, and that included traditional medicine and therapy and ceremony. And all the while, I was in quite frequent contact with the healthcare system. I had an oncologist who, a surgical oncologist, I had a medical oncologist, I had another oncologist, the one who prescribes the medications. So with all of that, I really felt drawn to go back to my traditional roots and explore my options for traditional medicine. So I went back to my healthcare provider, who by this point I was referred to an oncologist, a medical oncologist. But when I sat down to talk to the oncologist, she did not even turn to look at me at any point. She was writing within her notes and staring at the computer. And all the while I was like feeling uncomfortable, although I couldn't label it, I couldn't describe it. I just did not feel good about that visit. So I'd gone back to my surgical oncologist who I began this journey with. And he basically said that I could continue to seek care from him. And I said I needed to follow my own pathway. And I fired that oncologist, the first one, and he laughed. And then I was a bit afraid to tell him where I wanted to go with my treatment. And I did eventually share, after some trepidation, that I was planning on taking traditional medicine and going into ceremonies to treat my cancer before I even had that conversation about where I wanted to go with my Western treatment. And all the while I was really afraid to tell him this story and expected him maybe to ridicule me or to try to talk me out of it. But what he did instead was to sort of sit back in his chair, and he sort of smiled, and then eventually said, that is the attitude, exactly the attitude you need to survive. He said, you do anything in your power to be well, and I would support you. And he also said, and if you're going to go that route, I would really highly recommend that you try our medicine and our treatment as well to complement your traditional medicine. And I agreed, and I was very relieved, and I was very happy. And he just all the while just faced me head on. He never once took his gaze away from me, except maybe to smile and to throw his head back and laugh. And he was very accepting of my my personal views on treatment and medicine. And I felt very different than that encounter that I had with the first oncologist. And I knew that was something different. I couldn't label it. I couldn't tell you that it was him exercising cultural humility. But now, knowing what I know, and I look back and these two different encounters, that to me was an ultimate expression of cultural humility, where he was able to listen to me, to pay attention to me, and to respect my decision to engage in traditional medicine. So here I am today. I went through my traditional route. I also pursued Western medicine and the surgery and chemotherapy. And like he said, I did everything in my power to survive. And I thank him, and I'm very grateful for his humility and his acceptance of my beliefs. And I believe Jason as well has a personal story to share about.
Thank you, Wanda. I love that story. Yes, so I guess my personal story is more focused on me than an interaction with others. But I just wanted to share and talk from the heart a little, as much as possible, with a group of strangers anyway, about, I guess, my own personal journey and how I kind of came to be here and what I think has been helpful. So I grew up in a small place in Newfoundland, around 25,000 people. There was very little diversity. We were all, white, middle class, students growing up in school. My dad was a used car salesman for most of his life. My mom was a secretary or stay-at-home mom. I had a very loving, positive childhood, but also one with a very limited view or perspective or lens on the world. And I think naturally or subconsciously or whatever, you just assume that that's the way that you do things in that place, or the way things are done everywhere. And so later in life, I got to do a fair bit of traveling, and the first place that I went that was quite different was Thailand, and I had an opportunity to spend some time in some more remote or rural places. And I just remember being just shocked at the differences in the way that infrastructure was set up, transportation worked, the way that people lived and ate, and the things that they ate. And it was like at that time I had trouble like processing that people wouldn't do things the exact same way that I did them in Newfoundland. And at first I was very critical of those things. I thought it was foolish or stupid, or didn't make any sense that those things were happening in that way. But after I'm grateful I got to spend about 2 months there the first time that I went. And it didn't take too long for me to start seeing, behind the differences at, some of the reasons, why that worked in this situation, or how it was actually better in some cases to do things the way that they were happening there compared to where I did them, or to how I did them, in Newfoundland, or how they were done. But then I kind of bounced back the other way, and I started to get very critical of all the things that I thought were right, and like started to question the things that I had learned growing up. And that was a really uncomfortable place to be in my head. Shocked at first, and then respectful, and then critical of myself and my parents and everything. So when I went back to Canada, I was kind of critical of a lot of the ways that we had done things, and thought about things. But what that and a bunch of other experiences really, how they landed, I guess, for me, was really just made me deeply respectful of differing perspectives and ways to do things and think about things. And I got really, and I still am very, very curious to learn. Like, I love people disagreeing with the way that I think and the way that I think about things, because I feel like it opens my mind, and it creates opportunities for doing things differently and for innovation and just getting to know each other better. And so one other experience that I had, I got to go to Qatar for 5 years to teach nursing with the University of Calgary over there. And growing up, the only thing that I had ever learned, even as a young adult in Canada, the only thing I had ever known or learned about Muslim people or Arab people was terrorism, violence, guns, bombs, etc. And so I was nervous to go over there, because that was the stereotypes or the bias that I had learned. But I was also really excited because I couldn't believe that was the only truth. And yeah, I'm very grateful for that experience, because the people that I met over there were so generous, and so just demonstrated so much hospitality and kindness, and a surprising amount of open-mindedness, compared to what I had expected going over there. I'm very grateful for that experience, and it's probably not politically correct for me to even bring this up right now, but I wish that members of our government and other Western governments have had the chance, or would have had the chance, to have those same experiences as me, or had some kind of humility or humbleness towards Arab people, because I feel like if not just Arab people, but in this case, considering what's going on right now with Israel and Gaza, I think it's disgusting the lack of outrage that our government is demonstrating. And I have 2 dear friends who are Palestinian nurses, and it's horrible what they're going through right now. And it's the same thing that the Canadian government did to Indigenous people hundreds of years ago and continue to do today. So yeah, it might be inappropriate to talk about that right now, but also I feel it's worse to not talk about it. So anyway, just getting back, I guess, to how that's relevant to the workshop today. I think where I landed through all those experiences and through continuing to expose myself to different perspectives and ways of thinking is that I understand that I see the world in a particular way that's really informed by where I grew up and the way I grew up and the people that I've been around. And that's, it's okay to have that perspective most of the time. Just because I'm a white male doesn't mean, that my perspective is necessarily bad, but I have to be sure not to push that view on or that perspective on other people. I also find, and I don't know if this is just with me, I don't want to speak for other people, but I naturally assume that the way I think about things is correct. For the most part, like this, this is a mug and it's for drinking tea or coffee or whatever. It'd be exhausting to question every bit of knowledge that you had like that. But I think it's also important for me to be aware that I have that assumption generally. Then kind of following from that, when I do come up against different ideas and requests to do things differently, like say from students or different ways to approach projects, sometimes my initial reaction is that's not the way that's done, or that's not the way that we do things, or we can't do it that way. And so it's really, for me, I think the most important thing is being aware of that thought or that type of thought, and checking in with myself to ask, like, is that just my white Euro-Western perspective saying that, that's not the way it's done, or, is there like a valid reason for that? Or is it the system that we're in, or, what is it? And then is there a way that I can say yes to like whatever the request is, or to facilitate doing something differently? And one very quick example is I had a group of students in Sedansisk First Nation near our university a couple of years ago. And the lead instructor and the other instructors had decided that all the students would be required to do a written reflective journal, typical for a nursing program. And I had a conversation with the students to let them know, and they weren't very happy about it. They expressed some concerns, and one of them said, asked if we could just talk about things instead of doing the reflective journal. And so my initial reaction was, well, no, we can't, because the lead instructor and the other instructors said that we've got to do written reflective journals. But I stopped myself in that thought, and we collaboratively decided to kind of ignore that directive, and came up with doing oral reflective journals instead. We felt that was a much better synergy with the learning context that we were in, and there were several Indigenous students in the group who seemed really excited about getting to do something orally like that instead of in written form. And we did it, and we didn't even tell anybody about it until afterwards. And at the end of the semester, almost all the students said that they learned or got way more out of doing the journals in that way. And so, I could have just easily said, no, sorry, like you guys all had to pass in a paper, but I managed to catch myself before I did that, and then worked with the students to come up with a way that seemed unusual to me, but that seemed to work better for the students in that context. And yeah, I'll stop talking there. Thank you.
Okay, so I think I was quite eager and had jumped into these slides already, but what I really wanted to cover is sort of the academic perspectives on cultural humility. As we know, this discourse has exploded in the past couple of years, and it really was a conversation that started with cultural awareness and all the way to our discussion and topic, what we're talking about today. So I do know that there are many definitions of cultural humility that appear in the literature, and it's still quite unclear what it means at this, but at this point we do have like working definitions, and most scholars define it as a process, and a process of becoming more aware of your own culture and your biases that it can impact your behavior. And in theory, becoming more aware, then we shift our hopefully attitudes and behaviors so that we're more respectful and dealing with people of a different culture and how we interact with them. So I think we can skip on, yeah. So as noted by Cynthia Ferranda, Cross and colleagues, a number of years ago, they argue that cultural humility was described as a continuum. They started at the lower end of the continuum as cultural destructiveness, being that lack of awareness, that blindness that exists, and not sort of acknowledging that there is differences of opinion and beliefs other than your own. And in the middle end of the continuum, there is cultural blindness. You may be aware, but you still choose not to see that there are other ways of being and doing in the world. And then cultural competence, where you're developing perhaps a little bit more skills and tools to be able to interact with people, but not only people, but systems, and then ultimately leading to being more proficient in cultural exercising cultural humility. Next slide. So as you can see that there's not a clear linear process in talking about cultural awareness, humility, and sensitivity, but it's more or less a process, and sometimes those processes and those in those stages or concepts interact, and but all the while we know that in order to address and redress the harmful legacy of residential schools and colonialism, that there is a grave need to be more proficient in how we deal with Indigenous people. More recent discourse centers not on one's own behavior, but on being more aware of the power imbalances that exist that may have a direct impact on patients and our students in this context. And it involves a lifelong commitment to constantly check in with ourselves and our beliefs, systems, and our own attitudes. As Jason mentioned, he had gone and reflected on how those sort of biases and sometimes just the way we've always done things will come out and say, no, we can't do that, we can't bend the rules. But really, when we exercise a little bit of humility, we can accept and be more accepting of other ways of maybe perhaps evaluating students or even interacting with them. So, however, anti-racist pedagogy provides us with a different lens to appraise cultural humility and its related approaches. And the focus on equity and diversity does not identify or interrogate those colonial oppressive processes when we think about cultural humility from the perspective of differences. So as noted by Diffie and McNone in 2017, healthcare's focus on culture really tends to create that dichotomy between us and them without really critically interrupting some of the processes that result in harming individuals and others in our systems. So it doesn't really get to the root of the problem. So colonial oppression, power, and privilege is the issue, and barriers to achieving humility in the nursing profession have been highlighted in the discourse, and particularly by such scholars as Elizabeth McGibbon. She wrote that one of the greatest perpetrators of not acknowledging the cultural implications or sort of the harms of our behaviors and our actions or inaction in institutions is furthering racial oppression. And the belief also within the nursing academy that colonization is a thing of the past, where it is still very present in our systems and our organizations today. So when we frame our actions or our efforts with the equity, inclusion and diversity lens, what it does in effect is dismiss and erase that colonial history that Indigenous people have with this country, as well as many of the institutions in this country. So it really sidesteps those conversations, and those are hard conversations to have because of the history and this relationship we have to the Crown and to colonization that this has resulted in many of the health and social outcomes we see today. And not knowing that history and that that particular relationship really, or not talking about that relationship, it really does not address the root cause of biases and perhaps actions that continue to harm people. There's also our neoliberal philosophy, and that continues to perpetuate these oppressive forces within our institutions and our curriculums and our societies as well. When we look at sort of the philosophy that each individual are responsible for their own well-being and their journey and pathway in life, to some extent that is true, but many Indigenous people and marginalized groups don't come from that same place. They don't have the same starting point in our societies. So how can we expect them to get to the starting or the finish line when we don't start at the same point? So that we really have to keep that neoliberal perspective in check in our policies and our health systems when we look at individuals as being responsible for their own in the conditions that they find them. And there's also the biomedical and the white dominance that exists in the nursing profession, and those perspectives that we carry with us in our profession. So those are all factors that continue to preserve the status quo and keep things the way they always have been instead of moving forward. Next slide. So these are some of the beliefs and some of the factors that we want to be able to overcome and to be able to address when we are working within our health systems. And we know that these beliefs around especially the neoliberal philosophy and about each individual being the architect of their own destiny, we have to really take a look at how we are teaching our nursing curriculums around individualism when we don't really address the systemic barriers that and the systemic racism that exists within our systems. That would probably go a lot further in helping Indigenous people overcome some of the challenges that they face on a daily basis. So academic leaders have an ethical responsibility to influence current and future nurses in their learning environments, which can be enhanced through role modeling and humility, as the example as Jason had shared, and risk-taking in our own actions, not being afraid to make changes and to just try doing things a little bit differently. This not only begins with being aware of your own biases and your own beliefs around how the world operates or way of being, but also keeping in check your own power and privilege, and that most nurses and academic staff for that matter come from a place of privilege. Like I had mentioned earlier, in a race, perhaps we may not have the same starting point, and we have to keep that in mind when we are dealing with students that may be coming from communities that are more remote, lack access to resources and other opportunities that we may have had during our undergraduate training. So we know more today that there are alternative approaches that can be found in the fields of social work and other health sciences that we can build upon. We also know that lives are saved when we are more in tune with our own biases and how our belief systems come into play when we are interacting with Indigenous people within, whether it's in the healthcare system or in our institutions, that practicing that humility and combating racism and discrimination at every juncture, every policy, at every at the institutional level, as well as in our advocacy in the wider society. So just as we are need to be competent in using our tools and skills to help individuals recover and to achieve optimal health, such as using a defibrillator, we need to be just as competent in exercising cultural humility in every environment that we work in. So I'll pass it on to, oh, sorry, I forgot this one point. So healthcare providers are not expected to be cultural experts, and you don't need to know about First Nations culture to exercise cultural humility. That is really just being open and learning about how to be a better healthcare provider and to be comfortable with saying that you don't know and wanting to embark on that learning journey. So now I'll hand it over to Jason, and he will talk about some of the key characteristics and concepts when we are looking at cultural humility from an academic perspective.
Yeah, so we've been over, quite a few of the concepts already in different ways, I guess, but I wanted to go back to Wanda's point there before, and I was in a workshop yesterday, and somebody raised, an earnest question saying, like, with the focus that we have, on Indigenous people and pedagogy and health, are we forgetting about other ethnic groups in the that we work with and interact with? And we had a fairly wholesome conversation about it, but what we came down to is, if you're practicing cultural humility or being humble and checking that voice in your head that says that's not the way that we do things, and being inquisitive about other ways of doing things, then that benefits everybody, in my opinion. And this is a quote that we pulled out from a paper that Wanda and one of our other colleagues, Lisa Bork-Bearskin, wrote, that there needs to be a fundamental shift in nursing education within the academy to decentralize Western dominance. And those words are very powerful, strong words. And even, the sense of superiority that Wanda talked about before. I don't walk around thinking that I'm superior to everybody else, but I did say that I automatically assume that my ideas are correct and the right way of doing things. And sometimes, that requires me to check in on what's happening. And often, because of my background and the way that I learn things are done, I don't even see the system. It's just the way that things work for me a lot of times. And it takes people with different perspectives to point that out to me. And then when they do, I'm able to speak out against it. And there's been several times in the last 4 or 5 years when I've gone home and said to my wife, oh my God, Sita, I think I might get fired from my job today for speaking out. It's always so uncomfortable to resist those power structures. But I'm in a position where if I'm not going to do it, whose shoulders does that rest on? Yeah, so that's important to keep in mind, even though those words seem so intense. It's not always that intense in real life or that obvious. And, we do have a culture in nursing, and it's our profession is founded on some fairly racist values. Florence Nightingale was involved with the colonization of Indigenous people in Canada. So there's a whole history there that we don't learn about or talk about a lot of times. Miigam'agan mentioned, that it's the lack of culture that causes a problem for people, that creates problems. And so, how can we as educators or researchers or administrators try to make sure that culture is there in the university or the healthcare system or wherever? And it is, it's a lot more than just raising a flag. Okay, we can keep going. But there are a lot of things that are going on, I think increasingly so. I feel like a lot of what I've spoken about today is a little heavy or negative maybe, but there are a lot of amazing things. And I've had the privilege personally to work on so many amazing projects during my time here. And that's really, I think one of the reasons why I've been able to develop relationships with people like Miigam'agan and others locally who are really leading these amazing changes is because I don't go into those situations thinking that I have the answer or the solution to anybody's problems, or at least I try not to. And I guess one thing, I had another conversation yesterday. There was a couple of white educators who really wanted to reach out to Indigenous people and start to incorporate things into their classes, but they were nervous about saying the wrong things and didn't know how to go about it. And so like that inaction sometimes is hard to address. But what I did in the first instance really is I reached out to the director of the Friendship Center here and just asked her if we could have tea and chat, or if I could bring her over a coffee. And so I brought her over a coffee and sat down and heard about a bunch of amazing initiatives and priorities that they were working on. And through that conversation, kind of said, well, I have a bit of experience writing grants, so maybe I could help you get a bit of money to do this. Or, I know a little bit about healthcare or nursing, so maybe that would help you get from here to this other thing. And so that like positioning those partners' needs first over my own has been really rewarding, also very scary when I talked about risk taking. I think I've written, I don't know exactly, maybe $30 million in successful grant applications over the last 5 years. And I think about $75,000 of that came to me at the university. Like all those grants went to community partners and organizations. And that feels at odds with what's expected in an academic position. But I feel like we have to put ourselves out there or at risk a little bit more than we usually do. All right, we can go on to the next slide. And then allyship and humility. So this came up after the last workshop to have a little bit of a discussion about this, but I would never label myself as an ally. Like it's really important for me to work with Indigenous partners and to develop relationships, but it's not up to me to decide if I'm an ally or not. It's like up to, like, it's something that can only really come from the community partners that I'm working with. And I feel very grateful every time I hear somebody refer to me in that way, but there's also lots of people who wouldn't refer to me as an ally and might not like the approach that I've taken with some of the work that I've done. So for me to just walk in and say, I'm an ally, I'm here to help, like, tell me what you not even tell me what you want me to do, because it seems so silly. It's hard for me to even think about it, but I've seen lots of situations where well-meaning non-Indigenous people will go to an Indigenous organization or community and say, like, I've got the solution to your problem. Like if you have that idea, then you definitely don't have the solution. And I would say that most of the people on this workshop are already aware of that. But it is something, I think the most important thing really for me, the humility and in terms of allyship, is just getting to know people and listening and developing relationships, because then when I do something inappropriate or stupid, which happens fairly frequently, I think everybody on here will agree that knows me, I have so many friends and mentors and teachers that I have good relationships with, that they don't hesitate to correct me kindly. So yeah, I think that's kind of all I had to say about that. Just put the community members' needs first. Oh, one thing I did want to say was that some of the people that I spoke to in that workshop yesterday, they wanted somebody to come into their class, or they wanted somebody to help them do something. Like, you can't for the first time go into an organization or community asking for something. Really, like, you have to develop that relationship, and for me anyways, like, more to offer my time or my resources. Even like asking Miigam'agan to come, on this to help with this workshop, I was really hesitant. I'm always hesitant to ask the community partners that I work with to do things for me or with me like that where the idea is not coming from them. because I don't want to set up a situation where it's like, okay, well, I helped you do this, now you have to do this thing for me. I don't ever want there to be like an expectation that I'm owed something. Like I really enjoy the work that I do, and I get a lot out of just being around people and learning about, their perspectives. So in terms of, yes, allyship and humility, I think those are some important things to think about from a white perspective. Okay, I can't remember if this is me, but I'm going to go for it. So we've got another Mentimeter question. So you can open your Mentimeter back up on your phone or computer or whatever. So in light of the discussion that we've had, the academic, the Kookum Midge, mine and Wanda's own personal perspectives, we want you to think about some of the ways that you can incorporate what you've heard into your own work or personal environment. The code is 39762591. It's up at the top of the screen there. I like that. Instead of asking why, ask why not. I get that tattooed on my arm. Are we able to scroll down? And there we go.
So that's excellent. I think that some of the concepts we heard may have come from our grandmothers, and some maybe perhaps we have prior knowledge, but others, maybe some of you are just learners today. So I think the important pieces are those elements of listening, asking, being respectful, reflecting, actually practicing what we're teaching, or practicing what you're learning. And I think that Jason really touched on something important around developing those relationships and really asking ourselves, the work that we're doing, who is it going to benefit in the end? Particularly if you're working in research environments and around the type of research that you're doing. And asking, like, will that research really benefit Indigenous people or the communities that I'm working with? If not, then perhaps maybe we should be moving in another direction. So these responses are very, very good. And thank you very, very much. So another point I just want to touch on very briefly is around the questions that had surfaced after the last question is around what can we do that's practical? Can you provide us with some practical examples? I think without having to spell them out, I think there are many examples that we may have sort of alluded to or maybe shared with our examples and stories that you can actually take away. And number one is building those relationships, like asking yourselves, have I actually gone out to visit a First Nation or Indigenous community? Have I reached out to an Indigenous organization to see how perhaps we can improve our education curriculum? And is it you that's taking those first steps, or are we waiting for First Nation and Indigenous people to come forward? And sometimes it's just a matter of taking that initial first step and taking that initiative to build those relationships with Indigenous communities. So here we wanted to share an example.
Wanda, I think we'll skip the case example because we've only got about 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure that Miigam'agan and Mabel have time to speak.
Okay, so yeah, we'll just go on, and if you want to go to the next couple of slides, we do have some examples here that we will be posting this on, and it will be available after the presentation, so you can go on and read the more detail if you wanted to. So now we'll hand it back over, and as we are using this method, as I had pointed out to in the beginning, part of the way that we work in a good way and a respectful way with Indigenous communities is to actually give them a voice. And often we'll have maybe knowledge keepers that are within our institutions that we ask to come in to meetings, but they are only provided enough space to open with a prayer, and then their opinions don't matter after that point. But here in this presentation, we are centering their voices. We are drawing on their knowledge and their perspectives from their own Indigenous worldviews to be able to share with us today. So we're actually practicing some of that humility in the way that we are delivering this workshop. So as such, we hand it back to them to provide some final comments on the workshop. So I think maybe we'll hand it back to Mabel as you started the circle.
Sure. Well, that was really good, everyone. I enjoyed the feedback from the questionnaires, and people are right in there knowing what we're supposed to do, and we just have to practice what we preach, I guess. I don't have much to add. I guess maybe just to reflect on language that is so important in our point of view as Indigenous peoples that my colleague mentioned. It's the way we live, the way we practice. And for me, sometimes, you live the way you do and how you were raised. And as we act as a nursing and as a human being towards others, it's so important. But I think also, I'm married to a non-Indigenous person, man, and sometimes we talk about the language itself, and I assume people know what I'm talking about, but sometimes they say, oh, we have to learn how to do Mabel-esque way of understanding things. But one thing for sure, like when, as an interpreter, I did interpreting too, and it was really hard because of the medical terminology and the English words, what they mean in asking. But especially when the practitioners are rushed or they're specialized in a field, and you're trying to take time to explain to the patient, which is an Indigenous person or an elderly person. And they can sense right away that this person is rushed and doesn't have time to really go into the subject. But I think even as you step into the door, you know that you're going to communicate with this person just the way they act and the way they present themselves. And especially when they come in with a whole bunch of interns and students, be it medical doctors or nursing students. So you have to be cognizant of that. I think also in our language, the Cree language, I was explaining to my husband that his dad especially wanted our children to say please and thank you and all this polite stuff. And I said, I don't know. I said, there's no such thing as please really in our language. It's sort of embedded into the way you approach it and the way you say your sentences and the inflection. Otherwise, to us, it's like begging, like you're really begging when you're saying please. But it's a bit easier for thank you because there's just one word in our language for thank you, which is kinaskomitten. I thank you. But I guess just to be, if you're hearing the translator trying to translate what the patient said, and it's so direct, not to you, it seems direct and abrupt, but it's just the way we say things. It's not to be rude or anything, and it's not beating around the bush. Sometimes in the English language, I find you can go on and on about something. You just have to say one word to be clear. So I guess it's just the way we view the world. Other than that, I have nothing to add unless there were questions from the participants, but I'll let my colleague take over for now. Annie. Go ahead, Mingma.
Yeah, well, all in Mabel, thank you. So, yeah, I really appreciate what you've shared, and I think it's when we're those protocols of any given situation, and I think it's naturally we get awkward, or how we when we meet new people, and especially if you're not accustomed to it, or we have to navigate through those stereotypes and those the history or relationships, experiences, recent experiences in the medical industry. It gets we guard it, so it's really important for service care providers to be also conscientious of it. I know sometimes it can get difficult to try and navigate those emotions, how to be, and so on. But it's about, I like what has been put together here about self-awareness and process. And it really does take practice. Like, I have to orientate myself every time I leave my community, and even strategize a possible scenarios that I might encounter, and or what my daughters may encounter, or my son, and so on. So that historical relationship has many of us guarded, and we're wearing our armor, and but we've come a long way, and I so am uplifted and hopeful as I was observing that new term, the metameter or something that was put together. I'm really like looking at it with my wide eyes, to try and capture your thoughts, and that in itself is that receptivity, that we're all looking for, and that safeness of being here behind the screen, but really looking out to listen to and see what the participants are saying, and getting the general visual of the community. And I feel really hopeful, and I want to, I'm really grateful, and here, the way it works for all of us, we are also going to be advocating, what we're learning today, and we're going to be sharing this information wherever we go, and whatever circles we sit with, we're be able to share what's happening and the good work that's going on in the webinars of educating the professionals who are going in that direction, and how relationships are now woven into it. And so I want to thank you, Wanda, Mabel, and Jason, and all the ones who came to sit in the council here, and thank you. I am this is part of the wellness, and I feel like I've been lifted up, and so in the conversation here and what I've seen, and that's going to contribute to my wellness as well, mentally and spiritually, and and however that forms. And however that helps me in my experience here today. So thank you. Wegu Lalio. Sit. Welcome.
Alan, Miigam'agan, Miigwech, Mabel. I think we have a few minutes we have 7 minutes for questions, and hopefully some answers if anybody's got questions that they'd like to ask in the Q&A section down at the bottom there. I see we've got one already. So it says, what are schools of nursing doing in Canada to change the process of selecting prospective nursing students? It appears that right from the start, we have systemic discrimination and racism, which in turn contributes to a nursing workforce that is not as diverse as it needs to be, linguistically, culturally, ethnically, socially, etc. Yeah, so wanted you or anybody want to talk about some of the things that schools of nursing are doing or could be doing maybe?
I think I can actually share an example from Manitoba. We have the Kookum program, which is the Pathways for Indigenous Nursing Education. And they have a whole support system for pre-nursing, helping students get into nursing by providing them with some additional support, academic supports, counseling supports, and to enable them to apply into nursing. And then beyond that, they help and support the students to be successful while they are studying nursing. So that's just one example. It's a really good program that really helps to recruit and retain Indigenous students in the nursing and the learning environments. But I'm sure there are many across the country. And other examples that perhaps we don't have today, but I'm sure we can have others put their examples in the chat box so that we are aware of other processes and programs that may support Indigenous students.
Yeah, it's Mabel here. I was also part of the Lakehead University in Thunder Bay for a number of years as a representative from Manitoba, because we're next door neighbors, and how they recruited their students to Indigenous nursing students, whether it's from Northwestern Ontario or Eastern Manitoba. And it was really a good program. There was a board, and then we'd meet every year. We used to meet twice a year. And then, of course, with COVID, it went virtual. But it was pretty successful. I mean, the attendees and the graduates were getting there, but it was like Wanda says, they needed lots of supports from their own people in the university, whether it was elders and residents or fellow students, and to make it more appropriate for them. Not even the nursing students, but also you probably read statistics about grade 12 graduation rates in Canada for Indigenous students, and they're still struggling with that as educators to how many can we graduate, blah, blah, blah. But I think the more Indigenous programs or land-based teachings, they call them now, are incorporated, the more, and for nursing, medicine, to be more cognizant of how we use our own medicines, and that we do have a science in our ways of knowing and our plants, medicinal plants and herbs. So I think if that's incorporated more, I think we'd have more success, as they call it, rates in the white stream anyway, and trying to implement more of an Indigenous knowledge. And I think it's getting there. It's a bit slow, but it's getting there. You go say.
I also wanted to add that the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action not only talked about increasing the number of Indigenous students in the workforce, but they also talked about educating all nursing students about the true history of Indigenous people in Canada, what the impact of colonization has had on Indigenous people, the residential school experiences, 60s Scoop. All of those pieces are very important for every nursing student, and I would argue everybody in Canada to be aware of, because Indigenous people didn't land in the place they are today by their own choosing, and all these forces and these events and these historical factors have really impacted the health and well-being, and this is not very well understood in our schools of nursing. So I think the responsibilities are on the School of Nursing, not only to increase their complement of Indigenous students, but to do a far better job in educating all nursing students about the history of Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah, and it's worthwhile, I think, acknowledging Kazan's efforts recently to revise the accreditation standards to ensure that it's a requirement for all nursing schools in Canada to implement call to action number 24, which refers to that, the course or the education that Wanda was talking about.
So I think at this point, there aren't any other questions in the chat. So we just want to thank everybody at this time. And at this, from the last, oh, sorry, there is another one.
Yeah, we've got, I'll read that one out, Wanda, and we'll have a
Okay.
answer, and then we'll sign off, I guess. So listening to the remark regarding individualism being unhelpful for Indigenous people was interesting to me. I find it quite difficult given the current high value placed on individualizing nursing care. Planning effective nursing care that is appropriate and acceptable to the unique individual is a nursing standard. How should I, as an educator, change or work with this current expectation that nurses plan for care delivery that is individualized for the unique needs of each client? It's a good question.
It's a good question, and I think it is probably a question that we can all take back to our individual learning environments and to ponder that. But we don't have the answers, but we do know that this philosophy is not very helpful when it comes to dealing with Indigenous people who do not come from that place of opportunity that we all have. So I think the responsibility is on each and every institution to find out how to balance that that education so that it is not specifically centering on individualism and individual responsibility, but on society and the responsibilities at the health policy level as well as within our institutions. So yeah, so like we don't have.
At the same time as well, I think, individualized care is about like recognizing that every person is different and may need a different approach and recognizing differences between people. So that does fit quite well with what we're talking about. But the focus on the individual probably is not all that well aligned because it's more like, the community, the land, spirituality, all those things are equally as important. And you might miss that from the individualized approach. All right.
So there aren't any other questions there. I can't see.
No,
not
that's
able to scroll down. Okay. So yeah, we want to thank everybody for joining us today. We're hoping that we're able to share some more practical examples and some things to think about as you go back into your respective roles. We highly encourage each one of you to engage in these conversations at your institutions. Reach out to those organizations, those communities that may be able to help with the journey or the direction that you hope to go in the future. And I'll hand it over to Jason. Is there any final words?
I'd just like to thank everybody again for coming, panelists and participants.
Yeah, and just as a last word, cultural humility can be learned, and it can be learned through observation. And I think Kookum Mabel had mentioned in practicing it. So it is going out, setting out to learn about it, and then actually putting it into practice and maybe reflecting on some of those biases you may hold that you may not be aware of. So miigwech, and we'll just leave you with some references that you may want to incorporate into your reading materials in your library.
So, am I closing?
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, thanks very much for all those that have attended, and I hope you found it useful. From all the remarks I can see, it's been really good, and I appreciate and honor that we could participate and share some of the stuff that we know from our perspective. And we, as an individual, I also have to look at the way I view other people as well, and especially with all this multiculturalism that's happening in the world and all the unrest that's happening at this current time. But also there's always good news in that, especially for the children. We found about the court case. So I'm thankful for that on Jordan's principle. Anyway, I will close in my language and I usually translate what I say. Jos mä nohtain ainakin askumit nanoma. Kagi mama uyak, iwap mituak ja mikä uitap mituak. Mä koska vituutta mä kun mattuskivina limmiä, maski iskua kohotse, kahkilla uutaskiik. Kevotsia kihtsaka vaasissak, vamme kihtiatsak, vakahakita eten juok. Koska vituutta mä, koska tuutta mä kahiu. Isuap mä kihitsek, isuitsiu, uitsik, aga minä tänsäkeisi meloajatsek. Jos mamma nyt tuu, kanna minä omat katjatuskääk, koska tuttamaan. Vaan minä muissun, minä aina kookum kauitsiu oma katjatuskina. Thank you, Creator, for having seen us here virtually. Although we cannot sit by side with each other, we have shared what we can, and we thank you for the guidance you have given us, for the work that you have given us as nurses and educators, and that we help from the young ones to the elderly, and as we go around practicing our work as professionals and caregivers. And we ask that you guide us in all ways, and that we everyone has a good week as they go about their work and in their lives. Aho. Thank you.
Miigwech, everybody, for joining us.
Okay. Are we staying on after the Jason and Wanda and Miigma? I won't hang up then.
We'll say goodbye to everybody else.
Thank you, Wanda. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Miigam'agan and Mabel, for your wonderful words and what you've shared with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you, Beckley, for all your support.
Thank you. So, thank you. Thank you. Good to see you, Mabel, and everyone.
Are we